Did you know that San Diego Studio, Sony's development team behind MLB The Show, made an NBA series from 2005 through 2009? Maybe not, because these games were only for PlayStation consoles and handhelds, but more importantly, because this series was a commercial failure. And with game titles like NBA 06, it's not very easy to look up or discover. During this era, NBA Live and NBA 2K were neck and neck, fighting for market control, allowing Sony's games to fall into the shadows. But when diving into these games, there are a surprising number of innovative features that the more successful NBA games eventually copied and made popular in their own games, such as the shot meter in NBA 2K, which I'll dive into later in this video. These games weren't great, but they were ahead of their time, and they definitely weren't bad. Sports games aren't given the same attention as other genres of video games, and a series like this could easily be forgotten with time, especially if you weren't around when they launched. That's a big reason why I do what I do, because few others are really documenting and going over these older, more obscure licensed sports games. And sure, while modern sports games are mostly considered a big joke, they are still incredibly popular, and just a decade ago, the standards for sports games were much higher. For example, EA canceled NBA Elite 11 for being too buggy and unpolished. However, I played NBA Elite 11, and I found it to be much more polished than most of EA's more recent sports games they don't choose to cancel. The standard around the industry has gone down, resulting in some older sports titles that weren't very popular when they released to potentially have some legitimate value when playing them today in 2023. Sony's NBA series is a great example of this. These were NBA games that were from an era before microtransactions and before the domination of online play. These were games fighting and clawing to be noticed, with a market that forced developers to push the envelope and innovate, thanks to competition, something that sports games are lacking heavily today. Let's take a look at Sony's failed NBA series, starting with the generically titled NBA. Yes, it's just called NBA from 2005. I will eventually make a video on the NBA Shootout series, which was technically the predecessor to this series, as it was published by Sony and developed by 989 Studios, which eventually merged with other studios to form San Diego Studio. The first game made by SDS was The Mark of Cree, a unique action-adventure game for the PlayStation 2. There's your fun fact for the day. Their second game was NBA. NBA was the first game in this series, and it only released for the PSP, and it was actually the first licensed NBA game for the handheld. While NBA wasn't a groundbreaking title, for a handheld basketball game in 2005, it was quite impressive. Graphically, it wasn't that far off from a PS2 game, but it was very bare bones in terms of game modes and gameplay complexity. For a quick game of NBA basketball on the go, it was a solid game, but it wasn't something you'd want to play for that long. The next year, Sony released NBA 06, The Life Volume 1 for the PlayStation 2. This new NBA series had made its way to the console, but there was also another PSP version of the game, which included upgraded AI, new minigames, and improved gameplay. The new PlayStation 2 version was the one to get, however. New at the time for NBA games, 06 featured a scripted story mode, similar to what 2K would eventually use for my career. You'll notice throughout this video that Sony introduced some innovative new features with their NBA games, but they just weren't fully realized or polished enough, and the games simply weren't popular enough, and eventually 2K and EA would adopt these features. If you know the story of Apple and Steve Jobs, it's actually a perfect metaphor for Sony's series. These NBA titles were like Xerox computers. They were the first to have a graphical user interface and mouse to control the operating system, but the execution wasn't perfected yet. Steve Jobs came, stole the idea, and improved upon it, allowing Apple to grow far beyond Xerox. These Sony games were like Xerox, ahead of their time, but not good enough or popular enough to capitalize on it, and eventually defeated by competition that essentially stole, or you could say borrowed, their best ideas. As Steve Jobs once said, "Good artists copy, great artists steal." He was known to be an asshole, by the way. So yes, Sony's NBA 06 essentially created the idea of my career, with a scripted storyline that follows your created NBA player as he trains to get drafted and become an NBA star. The mode starts with a character creation screen followed by minigames and cutscenes telling the story. After completing the minigames, you get drafted and begin your career in the NBA, starting from the bottom as a second round pick. It was like a basketball RPG. With such a cool game mode, why didn't this game blow up? Well, compared to 2K6, the gameplay didn't hold up. While NBA Live 06 was hot garbage on the Xbox 360, NBA 06 was competing with the much better PS2 version of NBA Live 06. Interestingly, however, the gameplay of NBA 06 did have something the other games didn't: a shooting meter. This would eventually find its way into NBA 2K, but Sony did it first. I bet you didn't know that. When shooting, there was a half circle with a red, yellow, and green zone, and if you released it too early, it would be red or yellow, but if your timing was perfect, you would get a green light. Sony did it first. Again, the Xerox comparison is very fitting. Sony had taken some time off after the lack of success with the NBA Shootout series, and while they returned with some cool new features, it just wasn't enough. They knew for the next year they had to make a jump to the PS3 and take things up a notch to stand a chance. NBA 07 The Life Volume 2, released for the PlayStation 3, PlayStation 2, and PSP. The PSP port was essentially NBA 06 again, with a few new game modes like Conquest and a pickup mode that was similar to 2K's Blacktop. It even featured Dodgeball and Horse as minigames. At the time, it was easily the deepest and best handheld port of an NBA game. On the PS2, the Life storyline was expanded and deeper, and some new minigames were introduced, but the gameplay was essentially untouched. That was okay because Sony was focusing almost all of their attention on the PlayStation 3 version. First of all, presentation was dramatically improved. The game featured a legit TNT broadcast package, and this was a PS3 launch title that ran in 1080p and 60 frames per second, which was a big deal for such an early game for a new console and helped the game age pretty decently. This does not look bad at all in 2023, yet this game is nearly 17 years old. Gameplay was improved from the PS2 version, featuring more advanced AI that would double team hot players, fight their way out of screens, get in position for rebounds, and more. Things you would take for granted today, but were huge changes back then. The shot meter was improved upon, and was a defining feature of this series before it faded into irrelevancy. It also had some gimmicks, such as motion controls, where you could quickly move your controller left or right to perform juke moves. Sony was really trying everything to compete with the big dogs. Despite these improvements, it was still a flawed game. The AI will still make boneheaded mistakes, such as showing no urgency when the game clock is running out, or by committing constant backcourt violations. For some reason, despite it being on the PS2 version, the Life story mode was not included in the PS3 version. Instead, there was NBA Replay, a mode where you could replay the best games from the previous NBA season, such as Kobe's 81-point game. These game modes where you get to replay history are actually my favorite, and it was a cool touch. But overall, NBA 07 on the PS3 was still pretty bare bones, but it was improving. NBA 08 released for the same systems as NBA 07. The PSP version was yet again another super solid handheld NBA game, with even more game modes and minigames this time around. After the first title, NBA, was lacking things to do, you could now stay busy for hours on the go with the newest PSP version. NBA 08 on the PS2 was a different story. The life was still there, but it was basically the same as the year before, and it was getting stale. Nothing substantial was added to the game, making it a bit of a disappointment. The PS3 version of NBA 08 was much deeper, adding new features like an improved NBA replay mode, now allowing players to recreate what went down in the playoffs, and the game's visuals looked even better. The upside progression feature was sort of like the crib or a VC in 2K, where you'd earn a currency throughout every game mode and you could use it to get trophies, special basketballs, player cards, and more. Gameplay, unfortunately, regressed this year. Very little was changed, and some new issues came up, such as poor trade logic in the season mode and poor AI performance on the court. Sony needed to nail this title to continue their upward trajectory and potentially fight with Live and 2K for the throne, but they failed. Like a declining role player, Sony's series had potential but never fully reached it, and it was now fading out of relevance. NBA 09 The Inside was Sony's last chance to make some noise. They created the shot meter, they created the scripted career mode. What could they create next? They just needed one more big new feature, maybe that would save the series. This time around, the PS3 version included the story mode for the first time, and it was actually better than ever. It featured press conferences, 3 different storyline paths, and improved graphics. While this was the best iteration of the life, the gameplay was once again barely touched, resulting in poor defensive AI, clipping issues, and more, and the game's franchise mode was very lackluster compared to the competition. For a series that was once ahead of its time, NBA 09 was now feeling aged and stagnant. The PSP version was again solid, but the PS2 version was yet another letdown. NBA 10 The Inside was the final game in the series, and just like the first, it was only available for the PSP. This was the deepest version of the game on the handheld, and while gameplay wasn't changed much from previous years, it was a fitting send-off for the series, giving PSP owners one last first-party NBA title to enjoy. The series was done. It was over, due to lackluster sales and the competition beating it out. At the end of the day, this series was a commercial failure, but it actually had a great impact on NBA video games. The new features introduced by Sony may not have been perfected, but 2K would eventually fully realize them. This is why competition is such a great thing for these games. Had Sony never released these titles, we may have never gotten My Career or the shot meter in 2K. Competition breeds innovation. This is why I think San Diego Studio should return with a new NBA series. MLB The Show might just be the best sports game on the market. While NBA 2K23 is a game I enjoy quite a lot, specifically for the My Era feature in My NBA, it is an over-monetized game that seriously needs competition. MLB The Show 23 is proof that Sony can make a solid sports game that respects and celebrates the history of the sport without completely selling out like 2K has. I'd love to see them put their hat back in the ring and help push the genre forward once again. And even if they don't, Sony will forever have a large impact on basketball video games through the innovative features they created, whether they ever truly get credit for it or not. Thanks for watching.
Don't you dare run from it, there's no boogeyman, it ain't coming to hurt you. I think acceptance is somewhat of a virtue. To look your true dead in the face without trying to escape the regret or disgrace. I write these words aimlessly, but not without hope that somehow I'll stumble on something that's dope.